Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to Then and Now. I'm Rosalind Campbell, Assistant Director for the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, which hosts this podcast. As the U.S. primary elections occur across the country, setting the stage for the presidential election later this year, border security and immigration has emerged as one of the most important and contentious topics. Discussions have focused mainly on immigration across the U.S.-Mexico border and the large number of people who are said to be crossing this border illegally, as well as the dangerous and sometimes fatal measures that have been put into place to deter border crossing in some areas. This, however, is not a new approach, and as far back as the 1990s, the U.S. implemented the Prevention Through Deterrence policy. This policy increased security in points along the border where crossing might be easier, like around port cities, forcing anyone trying to cross the border into the much more remote and dangerous areas of the border, such as the Sonoran Desert of Arizona, for example. These policies, like the more recent attempts to place barbed wire in river crossings between Mexico and Texas, have directly led to the deaths of many people traveling northwards into the United States, but have not had a measurable effect on the number of people actually entering or trying to enter the U.S. via the southern border. Joining us today to discuss this issue is Dr. Jason De León, Professor of Anthropology and Chicano Studies here at UCLA, and the current director of the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology. He is also the executive director of the Undocumented Migration Project, a nonprofit that seeks to raise awareness about migration issues globally, while also assisting families of missing migrants be reunited with their loved ones. Dr. De León earned his bachelor's degree right here at UCLA and his PhD at Penn State University and was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow in 2017. His first book was published in 2015 and is titled The Land of Open Graves, Living and Dying on the Migrant Trail. His new book, Soldiers and Kings, looks at the lives of smugglers moving migrants through Mexico and is expected to be published soon by Viking Press. I'm so pleased you've been able to join me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start by talking a little bit about your background. Your background is in anthropology and archaeology. So I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about some of your early research on the archaeology of Mexico and Central America. Tell us a little bit about your training and your previous research and how you started to be interested in migration.
Sure. And I apologize if you hear any noises above me. I'm in the Fowler building, which we've been recently dealing with lots of water issues. And I think that they're actually doing much worse upstairs than we are down here. So any banging, it's, I think, trying to salvage the floor of the exhibition, the gallery upstairs. But I'm someone who studied anthropology and archaeology here at UCLA in the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology. So this is where I began my career and got my early training in both the archaeology of Southern California. So I worked for many years in Professor Gene Arnold's Channel Islands lab, looking at Chumash shell bead production. And then I also did some archaeological work in Tom Wake's zooarchaeology lab here at UCLA. And then eventually ended up working on some archaeological projects in Mesoamerica, particularly both in Mexico and in Panama with UCLA faculty. My dissertation was on ancient stone tools produced and traded by the Olmec of the Gulf Coast of Mexico. And so for almost a decade, my career was focused on very traditional archaeological methods and questions about human behavior in the distant past. And it was really through my fieldwork in Mexico primarily where I started to spend a lot of time with men and women who were from working class rural communities who were getting paid to dig ditches alongside archaeologists, myself included. And it was through those excavations that I got to know a lot of people who were getting ready to migrate because they couldn't make ends meet in their home communities, or they had just tried to migrate and had been deported. There was one young man who I met early in my career, a guy named Victor Baldillo, who had just tried to migrate to the Arizona desert, had almost died, had been kidnapped by smugglers, and then ended up getting deported back to Mexico. He was telling me all these stories when I was a graduate student, and I started to really reflect on what it is that I was doing with my career. I mean, here I was befriending, someone who we had some things in common, but in many ways our lives were completely, these radically different places. And, as a child of immigrants, I was one generation removed from potentially his life. And he really just kind of moved me with the stories that he told me about his experiences, and also I just got very angry about the things that he was experiencing and that people were experiencing along the U.S.-Mexico border that I was pretty ignorant about. I'd grown up in South Texas. I had spent a lot of time in Mexico. I'd grown up in Southern California, going back and forth to Mexico all through junior high and high school and into college, and thought that I had a good understanding of what immigration was like. But it was clear to me, talking to those folks who were experiencing it firsthand, that I didn't know anything. And so, in the middle of my dissertation work in Mexico, I decided that I wanted to make a major kind of career shift and start to think about, an anthropology of undocumented migration, an ethnography of border crossings. And when I began that work, I was anticipating never doing any kind of archaeology again. I was sort of imagining that it was a project that was 100% about people and about ethnography, and I was a little bummed out that I felt like I'd wasted 10 years of my life on archaeology, and now I was shifting gears. But what I didn't realize at the time was that the archaeology would come back in a lot of important ways for me. And I went down to Arizona. I had questions about what was happening in the desert, and one of the first things that I experienced when I went into the Sonoran Desert was someone showing me essentially something the size of a football field, just covered in backpacks and water bottles and all the possessions that migrants had lost while trying to make a dangerous multi-day trip across the desert. And it was in that moment that I realized that I could connect my interest with people, doing interviews, observing and their lives, that I could connect that with an archaeology of their experiences as well. And so, it's just kind of this archaeological approach to a contemporary political setting that then I would put into conversation with the ethnography. And so, as an anthropologist in general, I sort of think about myself as someone who I have questions about the world, and anthropology has all these tools in the toolbox that I can pull from, whether that's archaeology or linguistics or forensic science or ethnography. And so I feel like, since those early days in Mexico, I've really just been on this journey to ask different kinds of questions really about migration, and then looking for different methodological approaches that I can use then to understand this process.
So you've touched on this a little bit, talking about how, you thought you wouldn't be doing archaeology anymore, and then you are now combining that with anthropology. So can you talk a little bit about not just methods, but, how archaeology informs your current work with the people and the cultures and the history of Mexico and the US? How do those methods you learned in archaeology, but also just broadly your understanding of the history of those areas, how does that influence your current work?
I think it's important for us to have a sense of as a species, to have a sense of our shared history, both in, in our own communities and around the globe. I mean, we've seen that, the success of our species has been our ability to migrate, right? And so migration is something deeply embedded in the kind of the psyche of our species. And so understanding how that's happened globally and through time, I think, is a very important thing. But for me in general, I don't look at any topic without considering the historical backdrop or the deep history that sort of goes behind it. I mean, and whether it's thinking about, the many migrations that have happened across North America, or thinking about, the political histories of Mexico or Central America, all of those things, I think, feed into my both my questions that I want to ask about the world, the way in which I want to contextualize the data that I collect in my analyses. But just in general, as part of my interest in, I think too often with politics, we think about this stuff is happening in some kind of a vacuum, like migrants are at our doorstep just because migrants are at our doorstep, without any understanding of, like, well, politically, what was happening in Central America in the 1980s, what's been happening in Mexico in the 1990s, all these kind of historical moments that have directly fed into into these migration cycles, I think are super crucial to understanding this stuff, talking about it, and potentially looking for, things like immigration reform. But I will say that in general, as an archaeologist or someone with archaeological training, I can't look at the world without thinking about time, space, the environment. I mean, all of those things, fuel or shape my understanding of the world. And, what I've kind of written about a little bit in terms of this idea of an archaeological sensibility, which you don't have to be, most people who go on archaeological field schools or who study archaeology in school don't go on to become archaeologists, but they go on to become people, I think, with a more nuanced understanding of history and of the importance of material culture and the environment. And so I even when I'm not doing archaeology, I think I'm always applying kind of those frameworks to the way that I see the world.
So let's talk a little bit about the Undocumented Migration Project, which you founded in 2009. The UMP Undocumented Migration Project uses ethnographic, visual, archaeological, and forensics approaches to understand the challenges of crossing the southern US-Mexico border and the often fatal outcomes for the people that are trying to do this. So can you talk a little bit about the work you've done with this project and what you've learned, what you found?
Yeah, this project it's had many different aspects and elements to it. We've spent a lot of time trying to understand what archaeology can tell us about modern migrations, what forensic science can tell us about what happens to the bodies of migrants in the Arizona desert, and really what ethnography can do to help us get a more nuanced and in-depth understanding of the actual experiences of border crossers. And I think, for me, it's sort of the UMP is sort of driven by a couple of things. One, I have this deep curiosity about the world, and about the human suffering that goes on in it, and that we oftentimes gloss over, that we don't really understand. And so the UMP has been really my attempt to understand what's happening, around our planet, but also, how can I shed light on that in different kinds of ways. And so I think part of the project really is about translation. It's about capturing information or data. I put data in air quotes because I think it can be a complicated term when you're talking about people's experiences, often traumatic. But I think what the UMP is always trying to do is find new ways to ask old kinds of questions, and then also to find new ways to translate social science data for different publics. And I think at the end of the day, what I've really come to understand is that, millions of people around the globe suffer, if not more, because of, global inequalities, climate change, violence, all these things that drive migration, that force people out of their countries and pull them towards others. That so many people suffer, but what happens to those people at the U.S.-Mexico border and elsewhere is part of a much bigger system that requires a lot of work to understand all of the moving parts. And so I think the UMP too, I mean, it's trying to give us more nuanced stories about about global migration, so that people can understand it because this is the struggle that we have with I think working on migration stuff, is that it's a saturated market. I mean, there's a million stories about migration, and we've probably already read them 10 times before. Whatever comes out today, I look at the news cycle and I see a headline and I go, I've already read this story. There's nothing new that I'm going to learn here. And this is partly because we just keep telling the same story over and over again. And then I think people, not just me, blame me, and this is my bread and butter. I should be deeply concerned about every story that comes out, but I'm also like, I can't read the same story anymore. And so the challenge is to tell a different kind of story, so that people can learn something new, engage with the subject matter in a different kind of way, and hopefully be encouraged to have conversations about this stuff. But I think what the UMP has taught me is that some pretty simple things, like thousands of people have died crossing through the U.S.-Mexico border. Thousands have disappeared, and this is part of a strategy implemented by the U.S. federal government in the 1990s. This is not collateral damage. These are not unintended consequences. These are the direct results of policies that intentionally put people in harm's way, and that structure that exists at the U.S.-Mexico border has now been grafted onto Mexico. We now use Mexico to outsource the brutality towards migrants. But I think globally, the things that have happened in the U.S.-Mexico border in terms of the weaponization of nature, we are now seeing happening in the Mediterranean, in the Darien Gap, Turkey. I mean, there's a million places where this stuff is happening that has been this outgrowth from the things I think that really originated at the U.S.-Mexico border. But the UMP is, I mean, it's also this my own kind of journey to keep trying to understand more and more aspects of this, and try to find new ways to talk about this growing crisis that I think is only going to get worse in the near future.
I think that idea of weaponization of nature is such an interesting one. I remember reading about, a lot of the Syrian refugees and refugees from other countries with their boats sinking and things like that. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it, because it isn't necessarily unintended consequences in a lot of ways. That's an interesting approach. So speaking of these people and these stories, I'd like to talk a little bit more about these individuals, because I think one of the things that happens when you're talking about migration in the US is that the humanity is removed a little bit, right? Even the terms that are used are things often like illegal immigrants or even illegal aliens instead of people who are crossing the border illegally. And I think, words matter. And sometimes that conversation can focus on the legality of something instead of those people. So your work, of course, uses ethnography with living populations as well as forensic techniques to reconstruct some aspects of identity of those who have died crossing these borders. So can you talk a little bit kind of broadly about who are these people? What are the challenges they're facing? Why are they trying to cross the border despite knowing all of these dangers? And what have you learned about the individual stories?
Yeah, I think what happens oftentimes is it's really hard for people to see migrants as people. And there's a variety of reasons for that, right? Part of it's just like education about this stuff. Part of it is maybe not having any interactions with those communities, at least not directly, because I would argue that everybody in the United States who, every time we put food in our mouth, we're a couple of degrees of separation away from undocumented labor. And there's other industries as well that we're all deeply kind of connected to. But I think the thing with, understanding the experiences of migrants, oftentimes, people will see a parent with their kid trying to cross the Rio Grande or walking into the desert. And these are things on the front or going through the jungles of southern Panama. And they'll look at those stories and they'll go, I can't believe that somebody would risk their child's life and put them in that situation. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is instead, how bad must things be in those places for that parent to tell themselves that this is the best option that I currently have, is to walk through this jungle or to hand my child to a smuggler? And the people who are migrating now, it used to be that we could kind of simplify it into people are coming from Mexico because they're poor and they can't make a living there. I mean, poverty, of course, is a driving factor for many people who are migrating. But now we have to think about climate change, the drug wars, cartel violence, natural disasters, political corruption. There's a million things that are happening in the global South that are making those places unlivable. And when I began this project in 2015, the focus really was, in 2009, the focus really was on, rural, sort of impoverished people from Mexico leaving that country, coming to the United States. And now you look at who's crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, it's a hodgepodge of countries: India, Bangladesh, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, India, parts of West and North Africa, Central America, South America. People coming from all over the place for different reasons. Whether you're fleeing, devastating earthquake in Haiti, or back-to-back super hurricanes in Honduras. I mean, people are the demographics have radically changed. And one of the things that's become very clear over the last decade is that we can no longer think about climate change and migration as two separate things. I mean, they are deeply intermeshed, and we really have to take that seriously. But in terms of the people, I mean, they run the gamut. Unaccompanied minors, small kids, teenagers, by themselves, parents with their kids, extended family groups. And for me, I think the power of ethnography has been to kind of, think about those stories on an individual level, so that I can write about people's stories for a readership that then can get to know a few people. And then I would rather them get to know a few people well than know a whole bunch of people kind of superficially. And so, my kind of focus is always on the detail, the backstories and the experiences of a smaller group of individuals that then can be representative of this much larger kind of process. And I do think that it is important for us as citizens of the world to do our best to see those folks for the complex humans that they are, which oftentimes is completely erased when we talk about the undocumented or undocumented migrants, or we gravitate towards like statistics of who's coming, as opposed to thinking about each one of those statistics represents a person with a rich life, an important life, a life of value that we oftentimes don't get a chance to engage with or understand.
So your first book talked more about the migrants, right, and the experience and identity of these individuals trying to cross the border. But your new book, which I believe is just about to come out, talks more about some individuals who help smuggle these people across Mexico and across the border. What have you learned about those people, and how is that different or similar to the individuals trying to cross the border for their own purposes?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. My new book, Soldiers and Kings, will be out March 19th. And it's really, it was my attempt, like as I was saying earlier, to try to tell a different kind of story about migration. My first book focused on migrants. It focused on families of the missing, and I wanted to add something new to that conversation. And because there are so many players in the migration process, and we tend to focus really on migrants themselves, with an occasional nod towards the Border Patrol and kind of their role in this whole thing. And then when smugglers come up, it's typically in this kind of simplistic sort of framing of smugglers are bad people, they traffic people, and people get hurt and they die. One of the things that the book tries to do is to really complicate that narrative. And number one, I think a very basic thing that I begin the book with is to say human smuggling and human trafficking are not the same thing. And yet many news outlets and other folks consistently conflate those two things. Someone who is smuggled typically pays for that service. They are hoping to get across a geopolitical boundary. Someone who is trafficked has that happen to them against their will. This doesn't mean that I can't pay someone to smuggle me and then they trick me and decide to traffic me. That, of course, happens all the time. But, we need to think about human smuggling as, at the end of the day, it's a service that people seek out and pay for because they want to reunite with families, because there's a job waiting for them in Tennessee or in France or wherever. But those folks are actively looking for people that they can give money to who will hopefully and safely get them across a geopolitical boundary. But of course, things go bad all the time. Putting any kind of faith into an illicit economy is always a dangerous thing. But we should keep in mind that enough people get successfully smuggled to keep this business afloat. And so if everybody who smuggled was terrible and bad, this industry would no longer function. But, it's just enough. It doesn't mean that you're not going to die in the back of a truck or have some horrible thing happen to you. But there are enough people who get through that thing to the point where the system is able to keep itself afloat. And we have to keep in mind that, smuggling does not happen in an economic vacuum, right? That the global labor industry that needs cheap labor fuels the smuggling industry, as does border enforcement. We spend billions of dollars trying to stop migrants from crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, and we spend practically no money policing the workforce once they're here. And so the idea is, if you can get through this death gauntlet in Arizona or elsewhere, if you can survive that, we will, as an American public, turn a blind eye to when you're working in a Kellogg factory in in the Midwest. But to get through that death gauntlet, people need to pay someone to help them do that. And so, border enforcement and these labor markets really fuel smuggling. But also, what I wanted people to understand in this book is that smuggling is a $1 billion global industry, but it's one mostly populated by impoverished people who are just trying to make ends meet as well. And so wherever there's most of the book really focuses on it's all on people from Honduras. It's a group of young smugglers from young white Honduran smugglers and a group of young and middle-aged Black Honduran smugglers who are moving people across Mexico and trying to make money while doing it. Low-level smugglers, which is mostly who I hung out with, are often as destitute or worse off than the people that they're actually smuggling. They're just trying to make a little bit of cash on the side, but also those folks have become important over the last decade as migration has gotten more dangerous. And now to get across Mexico, you have to pay fees, taxes to cartels in different parts of the country, and you've got to deal with transnational gangs that are trying to tax people all along all these different routes. And so what it's done is created a market for young people who have gang affiliations or who come from gang backgrounds to then insert themselves into this smuggling market to broker these deals for people who are just trying to get through and get to the United States. But the book really tries to demystify who smugglers are, what the day-to-day life looks like, while also, I think, highlighting the humanity of the people who are involved in this process that really brutalizes practically everyone who comes into contact with it, whether it's the migrants or smugglers or someone who's moving back and forth between those two categories.
So I want to zoom out for a second and look at this broader system in the U.S. for how migration works and how it is policed. So in your first book, The Land of Open Graves, you argue that the trauma, violence, and deprivation that these migrants face when they cross into the U.S. are, quote, neither random nor senseless, but rather part of a strategic federal plan that has rarely been publicly illuminated and exposed for what it is, a killing machine that simultaneously uses and hides behind the viciousness of the Sonoran Desert, end quote. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the history of some of these policies and how the U.S. has weaponized nature, as you said earlier, over the last few decades to help them try to curb immigration with maybe success, maybe not success.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, and it's complicated, but also in some ways very simple. It all begins when a group of Latinx high school students in El Paso, Texas, Bowie High School, which is right on the U.S.-Mexico border, they start complaining about the fact that the Border Patrol is coming onto campus and detaining students that they are mistaking for migrants. And so they come up with a class action lawsuit against the Border Patrol saying we are being racially profiled on campus and being detained because you think that we're undocumented. So the Border Patrol then has to kind of, because people are hopping the fence and trying to run through campus or blend in with the local population, which was happening in San Diego and elsewhere as well. So the Border Patrol is getting all this flack about the racial profiling. So they decide that they are going to put all kinds of agents and trucks and infrastructure in and around El Paso to make it impossible to hop the fence and run into town and hide it. Because people were hopping the fence and they could just blend in with the local population. They say, as soon as you hop the fence, we will be there waiting for you. We'll arrest you and send you right back. So they fortify that urban zone, and it doesn't actually stop migration. All it does is it redirects people. Go, oh, well, if I go 10 miles east of here or 10 miles west, the border wall will drop off. There'll be no more agents. I can walk into the United States and then double back and get in. But the Border Patrol also recognizes that, well, if we do that, if we see someone walking out in the woods where the fence ends, there's a high likelihood that they are in fact undocumented. And so they thought about it as redirecting the flow of people to give them a kind of tactical advantage, over this. But then what they start doing in El Paso, in San Diego, in Nogales, is they fortify all of these urban zones and push people out into the middle of nowhere. And it really starts to kick off in the late 90s, where they shut down Texas, they shut down California, and they kind of leave the back door of southern Arizona open so that people now, instead of having to walk 5 minutes through a parking lot to get to a car and be driven away, they now have to walk across the vast and inhospitable Sonoran Desert, which could take 5 to 6 days to get to Tucson or someplace else to get picked up and driven to where they want to go. And it's those 5 days where they face dehydration, hyperthermia, all the wilderness wildlife things that can bite you and attack you, and just the general mountainous terrain. The idea was that if you have to walk across that, it'll be easier to catch you because you'll be dead, or you'll be exhausted by the time you get to where you're going. It's easier to kind of surveil, and it's much cheaper. And if the desert kills you, you can just say, well, the Border Patrol didn't do it. You put yourself into harm's way. It's not our fault, even though they've created the infrastructure knowing that that's the plan. And if you look at the 94 document called the Strategic Plan, they say things like, with traditional crossing corridors cut off, people can be forced over, quote, more hostile terrain, which is better suited for enforcement and less suited for crossing. It says if people do that they will find themselves in harm's way. And the thinking was, if enough people died during this process, word of mouth would spread and people would stop coming. That clearly has not been the case. You went from having a couple dozen deaths across the entire length of the U.S.-Mexico border prior to this policy going into place to now hundreds of deaths in Arizona alone annually. And so we funnel people towards the desert. It's a cheap way to kind of brutalize them. If they die, we say, oh, well, the smuggler brought them through, or they did it to themselves. But if you look at the attempts to evaluate this program early on, the Government Accountability Office was trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we know if this is working? And, the Border Patrol had said out loud that people will be put into harm's way, and that's the goal. And there's a chart that I write about in my first book where one of the metrics for measuring whether or not this thing is effective is a rise in migrant deaths. And so the idea is that if migrant deaths go up, then this policy is in fact working. And I was very shocked to see that in a public document. It's, of course, now something that gets buried. We don't talk about prevention through deterrence ever, even though it is still the number one security paradigm that we use across the entire U.S.-Mexico border, and now using it elsewhere. But the federal government has been very strategic about weaponizing nature, and the kicker of it is the desert can kill you. And the government can say it's not our fault, you did it to yourself, or that was nature did it to you. But also the desert destroys bodies quickly. And a lot of the forensic work that we've done have shown that bodies can disappear in a matter of weeks. And so, there are many people who die crossing the U.S.-Mexico border who will never be heard from again. And with the work I do with our nonprofit, with the Undocumented Migration Project, we're a tiny 501c3 that works with medical examiners. We work with families of the missing. We take missing persons reports. We collect DNA. We help to kind of facilitate connecting, these missing persons reports to the consulates and to the medical examiners. But our work, it's been clear that we've got close to 5,000 open missing persons reports, and in Arizona alone, there's something like 1,500 unidentified sets of human remains. So 1,500 families that don't know where their loved one has gone. And for me, that's what prevention through deterrence looks like. It is a killing machine, and it's also something that literally destroys bodies. And with all of my work, I think one of the most devastating things that I've ever experienced or that I've learned about is the trauma that families experience when they lose someone in the desert and don't know what has happened to them. I think that's probably the worst form of violence that we could inflict upon anyone else, is taking away of someone and then never and not providing any kind of ability for those folks to begin the process of healing or closure, because you don't know where that person is. Are they dead? Are they alive? Do they have amnesia? And the desert, disappears these people. And I've seen it, time and again, where it's just really, it's the worst form of violence that I think I've ever witnessed in my, going on 16 or 17 years of doing this work. And I can't imagine a more brutal form of punishment that could be meted out.
That's such an interesting take regarding the, quote unquote success of these policies, right? Because this is something we've seen a lot in current debates, right? Border security and immigration. I think last time I read it was second to abortion as far as issues of concern with the upcoming elections for both parties. And a lot of Republican lawmakers have campaigned openly on promises to slow or stop migration, but they are also often proposing policies that it sounds like will be successful in the sense that they will cause more deaths, but not necessarily successful in the sense that the same amount of people or more will still attempt to cross, if I'm understanding correctly, which is, I think, something interesting to think about. So I'd love to get your thoughts as we kind of start to wrap up here about what are some options going forward. I mean, neither of us are necessarily in a position to make these policies, but if we wanted to find a policy that was humane and could address immigration, I mean, what might that even look like? And I realize that's a really broad question, but is there a way to avoid this killing machine, and how might we construct a better system?
It's a tough question, and it's one that I'm asked a lot, and I think always with an unsatisfactory response. And I think part of it is, being an anthropologist. Anthropologists, I think, make for pretty crappy policymakers because we think about stuff in a variety of ways that oftentimes go far beyond what a normal person would be thinking about, but I think in a good way. And so when people say, well, what do we do about, how do we secure the border, or how do we deal with this immigration problem? My response is usually it's not a problem to be solved at the U.S.-Mexico border. That is a smokescreen for climate change, the brutal effects of global capitalism, political corruption. What we're seeing at the U.S.-Mexico border is the outcome of all those things, and it's like the knife wound happened in Central America from maybe you think about it like a U.S. hand sticks a knife into a body in Central America. All of those people have to come out now and try to figure out a way to survive, and then we put a Band-Aid on it, at the U.S.-Mexico border. Like, okay, we've created this open wound, and now let's put a Band-Aid on it. We'll put a wall up, and hopefully that will solve this problem. I think my number one issue at the moment is just I don't think people should be dying while migrating. I don't think people should be dying to improve the quality of their life or the quality of their family members, or to be reunited with loved ones, or people shouldn't die because of something like global warming. I mean, I think about a place like Honduras, which disproportionately feels the impacts of climate change, but Honduras is not driving climate change, right? It's like the U.S. and the global north is making other parts of the world unlivable, and then saying, well, now stay out of our country. We don't kind of want you here. And so I think part of this whole issue has to be understanding the interconnectedness of the things that we do in the U.S. have ramifications globally, and oftentimes we have a hand in what's making these places unlivable. Or we're holding this neon sign that says, get through this wall and we will employ you. And so I think we need to understand what's happening elsewhere, and how the U.S. is hurting those places and can potentially help those places. But also coming to the understanding that we rely so much on undocumented labor. And we don't want to admit it most of the time, but those folks, I mean, they're members of our community. They give to our country in so many different ways, and they're the backbone of so many economies. And yet, we really want to block out those notions because we're uncomfortable with admitting that. And so, I think any kind of policy move has to be more nuanced than that. The problem is that politicians will just tell you what you want to hear, or they will offer up simplistic solutions for these very complex problems. I remember I was at a Trump rally in 2016 because I thought it'd be funny. I thought, okay, I'm going to go see this clown show that this is never going to happen. And it was in Michigan where I was teaching at the time, and I remember Donald Trump comes out and they're chanting "build a wall" and all this stuff, and he says, "You know what? I'm going to come up here and I'm going to build this great big giant wall." And he's talking to a bunch of auto workers or ex-auto workers, unemployed auto workers. He says, don't worry, build this big wall, and that wall is going to prevent Mexico from stealing your jobs. and everybody's cheering and saying, "Oh, this is great," not realizing that, like, Mexico is not coming here and saying, "We want your auto plant. Let's send it to Hermosillo," or wherever they're putting them. It's that these U.S. business owners are saying it's much cheaper for us to build these cars in Mexico than it is in the U.S. But it's like, but politicians don't want to admit that. I think that there's some segment of the U.S. population that doesn't want to admit that our own citizens are oftentimes, could care less about the working class. And I think there will be no movement forward with policy until we can have those kinds of conversations. People can say, look, when people can see past the smoke and mirrors of border enforcement as a problem. I mean, for me, it's not the issue; it's these other things. But we're in an election year, and talking about the border and talking about migrants as the problem is that's a tried and true political strategy, and we will see it this whole year. And what we need is the public to ask better and smarter questions about those things, and to say, look, tell me about climate change. Tell me about global inequality, or about U.S. interventionist strategies in these countries that have made some of these places unlivable. I think until our public starts asking those kinds of questions to politicians, we're going to stay in this cycle of, let's put more money towards border security. Let's deport more people. Let's talk about the symptoms and not the actual root problems.
Well, that's a great note to end on, something for us to think about and try to ask better questions of our politicians as we approach these important elections. Primaries are ongoing, and of course we have the presidential election later this year. So I want to thank you so much, Jason, for joining us today, for providing a path forward, right? Thinking about holding our politicians accountable and asking them better questions. So thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.